Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 19 Roaring Twenties lecture here today. As you can see, I'm here with my buddies in my speakeasy. We're skirting the law and having all the alcohol we can possibly enjoy illegally. So I'm going to try to make this lecture nice and short and simple and concise for you guys. And we're going to talk about the Roaring Twenties today. And the lecture outline has been posted to Blackboard, so you can follow along with it. Um, and this is So, the way the history of the United States often operates is we have these eras where we move forward and then we usually take a step back. And certainly the 1920s is one of those eras where we take a step back. So, if you think about all the stuff we talked about recently with the progressive movement, of all those reforms and progresses moving forward, in the 1920s, we're basically going to say, yeah, we're going to put that on the back burner for right now. And so we typically look at the quote unquote roaring 20s as a return of laissez-faire economics. It is typically viewed as a decade of prosperity and excess. There are lots of things that are going to develop in this era that will become kind of synonymous with American consumerism and things like that. For instance, credit spending. Now, not credit cards. The first credit cards really don't develop until the 1950s, but we do start to see people buying on credit lines at stores, buying things like radios and refrigerators and things like that. But while this is going to be a decade of economic prosperity for lots of people, there will still be discrimination. There will also be economic depression for others, disillusionment for others. Obviously, there's going to be lots of different hardships that develop during this period. Now, in 1920, when Warren G. Harding becomes president, he in a speech says that we're going to have a return to normalcy. Now, he made up the word normalcy. Now it's part of the dictionary, but it was a term that he just made up. And he basically was saying that Americans were tired of progressivism, they were tired of reforms, and we do have this sort of war hangover from World War One, where we're like, we fought World War One. Europe didn't listen to us at all with Wilson's 14 points. We are just going to move on. And we didn't talk a lot about World War One in this class. That's just, for one of the reasons we just kind of got to gloss over it. But Europe really didn't listen to us. Now, the United States is doing really well in all sectors because of World War One. I mean, Europe has been torn to shreds, and so Europe is relying on American agriculture, American oil, American factories to help rebuild Europe. But this period will be defined by conservatism, pro-business, and it will be staunchly Republican. So all those ideals of Woodrow Wilson and that progressive era policies are going to go out the window, and we are going to have these progressive or these more standard policies. Now, this also means there's not going to be any regulation. And this is going to be one of the reasons why we eventually get to the Great Depression. So, the Great Depression and the New Deal will be our next lecture on Monday, which strap in because we're going to have to get through a lot in that lecture before you have your take home exam. So, Warren G. Harding is typically ranked as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. Um, there were lots of scandals in his presidency, lots of corruption. There's a alleged quote from his mother that said, "Warren, if you were a woman, you'd be pregnant all the time." And what she meant by that was that Warren G. Harding surrounded himself with people who were not good. They were relatively bad people who just sort of did not do what was best for the United States. And the way you got to think about Warren G. Harding is while these scandals will come up under his presidency, he may not be directly in the know of them, but he has hired the people in these positions that are going to commit these scandals. And that means that effectively it's like a college football coach. A college football coach, if his assistant coach does something unscrupulous, then he's kind of responsible because he's part of the hiring of that assistant coach. So I'm just going to go over some of the scandals real quick, just a few of them, and then the big one, the one that most people know. The Veterans Bureau scandal. Um, Veterans Bureau scandal saw people within the Department of War, still called the Department of War at this time. They were abusing their powers. They were stealing supplies. They were funneling money that was supposed to go to veterans to other, to themselves, basically. They were diverting funds from care for veterans. And this erupted into a major scandal because we are dealing with a period that is immediately after World War One. So the United States now, basically since the Civil War, has the most veterans that they are having to manage in the history of the country. And you have to also remember there are still War of 1898 veterans. There are still a few Civil War veterans around that are part of this situation. And the Veterans Bureau scandal got so bad that the people involved, there were suicides committed, and it was a real blight on the Harding administration. But again, the American people were kind of turning a blind eye to these because they were, for the most part, the people that middle class, upper class, they were doing pretty well. And so these scandals, while they were interesting, did not bother them that much. The Justice Department had its fair share of scandals, and most of that revolved around prohibition and taking bribes from bootleggers who were either illegally making, moonshine, the origins of NASCAR, bootleggers and moonshine runners, or people who were bringing in alcohol from Canada, which was in the Northeast. That was where most of the illegal booze was coming from, was from our great neighbors up north. Um, Alien property custodian scandal. Again, this has to do with bribes, giving people land, and it's kind of one of the more boring ones. But the big one is the Teapot Dome scandal. Um, and the Teapot Dome scandal, uh, at the time was called the scandal of the century, and it kind of looks kind of timid by our definitions of scandals of what had happened. But the Teapot Dome refers to an oil field in Wyoming. And it's called a Teapot Dome because there's a rock structure there that kind of looks like a teapot. I know, really creative, right? So in this scandal, the Secretary of Interior, Albert B. Fall, leases these oil fields to Harry Sinclair, Oil, the dinosaur, But he does so without competitive bidding. And the reason why there was no competitive bidding was because Sinclair gave Fall $400,000 in loans. Were they to be paid back? Probably not. Now, this means that the Sinclair Corporation has illegally gotten access to federal property to drill for oil. Now, this means that Albert B. Fall is guilty of committing fraud. Now, did Harding know about this? Probably not. If Albert B. Fall went to the president and said, "Hey, Harry Sinclair is going to give me $400,000," but no, he's not going to do that. But again, it goes back to that idea that Harding appointed Albert B. Fall, and so that is why Harding gets the blame for it. Now, a little side story of the Teapot Dome scandal is that Big Oil helped Harding get elected by basically buying votes. They poured money into his campaign because they wanted to get rid of those regulations from the Wilson administration. And a guy by the name of Jake Hayman, who was a prominent oilman who helped Harding get elected, was going to become a member of his cabinet, likely the Secretary of State, which eventually didn't go to him. However, he had a mistress by the name of Clara, and this is a tie to Oklahoma. So Hayman does not get the Secretary of State job. He's got all this money, and he decides he's going to flee to Mexico. American money would go a long way in Mexico. Well, he's older. His mistress Clara, much younger, and they decide to flee to Mexico. They end up in a hotel in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And while down there, He threatens to end the relationship, and she is not having this. She has put up with this old man, and she's done it for the money. And so she murders him and takes the money and runs. She's eventually caught, but she is not convicted of murder because of the situation. And it's just a side story that, we're still dealing with. This is still the wild west of politics and economics and money and everything else. And in this era of no regulation, it really was whatever goes. And it's just a fun little side story about that. But the Teapot Dome scandal, the Veterans Bureau scandal, all these things play into this corruption at the highest level of office. But again, people are making money, so they don't really care. Now, that does not mean that everyone was making money. There's still a massive lower class, but as tends to work out, that lower class isn't taken into consideration very much. Well, in 1924, after Harding dies, basically of health complications and everything else, uh, he is replaced by Calvin Coolidge. Now, you will notice that on this outline, there is not much on Calvin Coolidge. Uh, Keep cool with Coolidge. Yep, that's pretty much sums up the Calvin Coolidge presidency. He didn't really do much. He just sort of maintained the office. We're going back to that 1880s, 1890s window of big business kind of running America. So while there are some things that he did, and he does have some ties to Tulsa with, when KVOO launched, he was there helping launch KVOO and things like that. But uh, he beat Robert La Follette, the extremely progressive candidate, in 1924 to remain president. Now, he's only going to serve one full term and serve out the remainder of Harding's term, and in which there's nothing really that we need to worry about of note that he did. But that end ushers in Herbert Hoover in 1928. And Herbert Hoover was known as the Great Engineer. He had a long career of being an actual engineer. He worked in gold mines in Australia and China. And he was also, and this is where Herbert Hoover becomes sort of complex. He was considered to be the great humanitarian. He got this name, this moniker, from his work in helping restore Europe after World War One. But again, it's ironic because while he was regarded very highly in Europe for what he did to help rebuild Europe after World War One, in the United States, when the Great Depression hits, he doesn't do anything. And his argument when the Great Depression hits, and we'll talk about this in a future lecture, is essentially that the Great Depression is just a part of the economic cycle. It will eventually end, and we don't need to worry about it. And you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I will say this again in the next lecture, I'm sure, but how do you pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you can't afford to buy any boots? He never really got the struggle of the Great Depression. He just thought it was part of the natural course of the economy that would eventually correct itself. That is part of laissez-faire economics, and we'll talk about that again more in depth in the future. Characteristics of the era: prosperity, urbanization, mass communication. Radio becomes hugely important. As I said, people were spending money buying on store credit lines, radios. The equivalency of buying a radio today, now today we can go pick up a radio for nothing, right? But if you were to put it in modern dollars, a radio set for your home would cost somewhere between the equivalency of 2,000 to upwards of $5,000 of modern American money. Same thing for sewing machines, refrigerators, etc. All these things were brand new, super expensive. Think about when things have debuted in your life where they came out and they were super expensive and then the price slowly goes down. I remember when the first VCRs and camcorders came out or the first CD players, you would go pay $1,200 for a CD playing sound stereo system. By the mid 90s, those were down to like $70. So We do have the mass communication aspect. Telephone lines are going to start to expand. Electricity is going to start to expand throughout the country. We also have in the 1920s a development of leisure time because more and more people are working jobs that are what we consider middle class jobs, um, white collar jobs. People are starting to develop the concept of the weekend. They're starting to develop the concept of vacations. They are starting to develop the concept of going out to the movies. Movies are very new at this period. Um, Again, entertainment and popular culture. You're going to have the birth of jazz music. You're going to have movies. You're going to have sort of minstrel shows, and you're going to have, things like Coney Island and stuff are going to develop. Now, we call this period an oligopoly, which basically is the idea that the country is being run by a small group of big businesses. And some people would make equations to our current modern situation. And if you think about oligarchs, when you hear that term, oligopoly is tied into that same general concept. Advertising becomes huge during this period. This is sort of the early development of what we consider Madison Avenue. You think about Mad Men in the 50s and 60s. This is where people are starting to be advertised to. One of the big things that happens like in the 1950s is people like refrigerators. I'm gonna use that as an example. Refrigerators that were built in like the 30s and 40s were really, really good and they lasted forever. And so the refrigerator companies were like, how do we sell more refrigerators? Advertising. Hey, your white refrigerator is old. It's not hip with the times. Check out this new baby blue refrigerator. So advertising. Personal credit was huge, and also installment buying and buying on margin. And installment buying and buying on margin is something I will discuss when we get to the Great Depression. It's basically when people are buying stocks but don't actually have the money completely to buy those stocks. Now, there are in this period changing social values and social mores. There's the idea of relaxed sexual standards. And we talked about some of this in the Progressive Era with Margaret Sanger, birth control, the idea of women actually enjoying sex. You also have Sigmund Freud, who was developed during this time and defines sexual desire as the primary motivational energy of human life. Now, a lot of this has been debunked or questioned over the years, but Freud's argument was basically that everything a human does, whether or not it's waking up in the morning, grooming themselves, getting a good job, is to impress someone that they want to have as a mate. Now, Freud would have no problem with homosexuality. He would say it's the same thing. You do this to attract a mate. And he based some of this off of the animal kingdom, of how, especially birds, male birds will create elaborate nests to attract female birds. And he kind of extended that to the human species of the same way. And while some of it has been discredited, not all of it has. I do want to speak very briefly about flappers. Now, flappers, I always make this equation, flappers and hippies. If you were to watch movies and things like that, you would think that every woman in the 1920s had short hair, was showing all this skin, dancing around, drinking and smoking cigars. And while some women did that, they were a very, very small minority. Just like in the late 1960s and early 1970s, while there were all sorts of people talking about free love, having long hair, wearing tie-dye, and all that fun stuff, they were very much a minority of American people. The vast majority of Americans are just still normal. But flappers come to represent sort of this wild out there spirit of the 1920s. Women are going out unescorted. Women are, heaven forbid, showing their arms and ankles, and they've cut their hair off. And a woman is smoking a cigar, like I said. And it's seen as this, whoa, what a huge change in American society. Um, Speakeasies during the era of Prohibition become very popular. This is the era where it's kind of funny. Pop, soda, whatever you want to call it. I call it pop because I'm from Oklahoma and I say it the proper way. It is pop. Pop becomes very prominent during this period, not only because alcohol has been banned and people want to have something to give them a little jolt, but also because the alcohol that is available is typically very bad, and so they need mixers for it. So things like early versions of 7 Up and ginger ale, root beer was sold as a tonic basically at this time. You see these all develop during this period of the 1920s through these speakeasies. But speakeasies were typically ran by gangsters, which we'll talk about here in just a second. In the era of entertainment and culture, now I would ask you to go on YouTube and watch a clip of Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer. Now, the Jazz Singer was later remade in the 1970s with Neil Diamond, but in this one, this is the first talkie. It's the first movie where people could go online, or not go online. If you're going online in 1920, you're a time traveler. But people could go to the theater, and the picture on the screen had words. The silent film era was over. This is a massive transition. The silent film era goes away, and all those actors in the silent films all of a sudden have to figure out how to actually act and talk. And some of them it doesn't go so well. But in the Jazz Singer, you will see if you put in Jazz Singer Al Jolson, typically one of the first results is him singing Mammy, and he is in total blackface, complete with the solid blackface, overdone red lips, and it is to us offensive. At the time, it was a groundbreaking piece of cinema. Also, there's Metropolis, which you can go look at. Metropolis by Fritz Lang is a German piece, and this is a silent film, and it is kind of insanely crazy. And it has to do with struggles with modernity. And if you watch the trailer for Metropolis, you will see how a human woman basically become, or how a machine becomes a human. And then you also see these machines eating up workers. This is sort of that other side of still struggling with modernity and how we're going to deal with this incoming industrial age. The 1920s is also a huge era for sports and athleticism. Notre Dame football, largely pushed by radio and the fact that, Notre Dame, I'm not a Notre Dame fan, but Notre Dame has that built-in base of having Catholic fans. And so they had a nationwide appeal. And it swept the nation. College football on the radio. Um, Babe Ruth will eventually become a fan of college football and help popularize the sport. Your first sort of superstar in the world of college football and football, pro football was kind of viewed as barbaric at this point. It's not like the NFL today that dominates sports in America. But George Red Grange, who played at Illinois and then later Chicago Bears, becomes sort of the first national superstar in the field of football. Boxing was wildly popular, and a lot of times boxing rings was where these conflicts between nations would take place. Here's the American going against the German, or the American going against, someone else. Jack Dempsey was the huge star. And then baseball, which is, maybe not as popular as it used to be here. Babe Ruth is largely considered the very first sports celebrity when he was playing for the New York Yankees. Now, another darker aspect of the 1920s, and this is fueled by Prohibition, is the rise of organized crime. And Al Capone, the original Scarface, who is known for the St. Valentine's Massacre, which took place on Valentine's Day in 1929. This was all about booze. I mean, let's face it. If you outlaw something that people want and people don't think is inherently bad, they're going to find ways to get it, and often illegally. Maybe in our modern world, you can look at things like marijuana, but when they outlawed alcohol, it basically created organized crime. It gave gangsters a product to sell to American people that they wanted. They didn't care if it was illegal. But what happens is this creates turf wars, and this is where we get a lot of the gang versus gang violence. Now, when the Great Depression hits, Al Capone kind of becomes what people view as sort of a Robin Hood or a social welfare reform. He will have soup lines and soup kitchens and help give people jobs. And so organized crime in this period becomes very, very prominent. And it's all because Prohibition gave them a product to sell. There's all sorts of gangs. There's Jewish gangs, Russian gangs, Diamond Schultz and or Dutch Schultz and Legs Diamond. Um, Massive war between the Jewish mob and the Irish mob in New York, and this spills over across the country. There's mob activity in Tulsa. There's Kansas City had a massive amount of mob activity. It's not just limited to Chicago and New York like the movies would make you think. Well, I told you that we talk a little bit about the KKK in this period, and there is the rise of the KKK. And this KKK that develops in this period is going to target African Americans, Catholics, Jews, foreigners, bootleggers, evolutionists, and anyone they consider a moral miscreant. That definitely ties into anyone that would potentially be a homosexual, obviously. The original Klan died out in the 1870s. This Klan comes back um, uh, in essentially 1915 in Stone Mountain, Georgia, a Methodist minister who had been inspired by D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. Now, The Birth of a Nation is a very interesting film. Birth of a Nation, we talked about Reconstruction in this class. Birth of a Nation makes the North look like the bad guys of Reconstruction. It makes the Klan look like the heroes of Reconstruction. And again, go watch scenes on YouTube from Birth of a Nation. It's a silent film. It's considered to be, while the content of it is repulsive in a modern context, it is considered to be the first epic movie, and it is still studied to this day for its filmography and how it was constructed. But it does put the Klan in a good light. And people watch this, and this becomes the interpretation of Reconstruction into the 1960s that the North was wrong and the South was right. It's not until we get to the revisionist historians of the 60s that we start to view the South as the bad guy again. The Klan rapidly expands. It has appeals in the North and West. They'll have governorships in several states, including Alfalfa Bill Murray here in Oklahoma. It's spread as far northwest as Oregon. Uh, it has to be understood that they feared not only minorities, but also modernity as well. So, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. This is part of the nativist movement in the 1920s. Sacco and Vanzetti were two victims of this movement. Bartolome Sacco and Niccolo Vanzetti, or Niccolo Sacco and Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. And on April 15th, 1920, two men robbed a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts, and they stole $15,000 of payroll money. This is back when people got paid in cash. You didn't really get checks, you got paid in cash. There was $15,000, a lot of money for that time. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested for the crimes. Neither of them had a criminal record, but they were outspoken anarchists. They had been labor organizers, and they had been anti-war activists. Um, they are found guilty in 1921 despite a lack of evidence. And in 1925, another man actually confesses to the crime. And despite the fact that there was bullying of witnesses, jury tampering, evidence tampering, etc., they are still found guilty. And in 1927, Sacco and Vanzetti are given death sentences, despite clear evidence that they may very well be innocent. There are massive protests in the streets. None of this helps. They are executed anyway. Now, this is an example of how the anti-immigrant sentiment ran wild during this period and how it was very difficult for immigrants to move past that given the climate that they were living in. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about here is religious fundamentalism versus religious liberalism, aka versus religious liberalism versus evolution, aka the Scopes Monkey trial. Tennessee passes the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach anything other than creationism in schools, in public schools, obviously. Now, the Scopes Monkey trial, I will tell you right now, is a show trial. It was developed by the people of Dayton, Tennessee, to bring people to that town for tourism. And poor John Scopes is going to be charged in this and have his name dragged through the mud. And he is going to basically, it's going to establish this long running debate between science and religion. John Scopes was a substitute teacher, he was a football coach. He didn't actually teach evolution in the classroom. He simply used a textbook one day that had evolution in it. Well, the town saw this as a way to create this show trial. And this show trial is going to be the trial of the century. It's going to be broadcast on radio networks throughout the country, and it's just going to be massively, massively publicized. So, what happens? John Scopes is charged with teaching evolution. He is going to get representation from an ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union lawyer by the name of Clarence Darrow from Chicago, arguably world renowned as an attorney. He was an agnostic but insanely familiar with the Bible. Going up against him was a guy who wasn't necessarily a lawyer. He had been a former political presidential candidate who had lost several times. He was kind of a minister and a figure, William Jennings Bryan. And this is going to pit, and I want to explain what I mean by religious fundamentalism versus religious liberalism. Religious fundamentalism basically says the Bible is law, and what it says in the Bible is strictly what you have to abide by. And the couple very easy ways to look at this is thou shalt not kill. Okay. A religious fundamentalist would believe thou shalt not kill. But wars happen. That's where we get to religious liberalism. And religious liberalism would dictate, well, yeah, thou shalt not kill, but sometimes it is justified. That is all we're talking about here. Fundamentalism versus liberalism. The same thing applies to the US Constitution. Strict constructionism versus loose constructionism. The right to bear arms. Well, if you're a strict constructionist, you have the right to bear arms. But almost no one is truly a strict constructionist because you wouldn't say, well, it's okay for Gary to have a nuclear bomb. It's interpretive. Well, in the arguments, and I'm not going to read the H.L. Mencken stuff here, but you basically, this is where we start to develop that idea of the North making fun of the South as being dumb. And this manifests itself through radio broadcasts, but also through H.L. Mencken, who is this renowned reporter from Baltimore. And he just really tears apart William Jennings Bryan and this pro creationism argument. But what it comes down to is Clarence Darrow examining William Jennings Bryan. So the attorney for the city of Dayton takes the stand. And he argues what is known as the 6 days or forever argument. If you read the Bible, it talks about God creating everything in those 6 days, and on the seventh, he rested. Here's the issue that Darrow brings up. Bryan argues that biblical scholars, have pointed the exact moment that all this happened. And Darrow says, what's a day? What's a day? Does in the Bible anywhere it says a day is 24 hours? Does it even mention an hour? It says a day. It has years, but what's a day? So when the Bible says a day, could a day been 1,000 years? Could a day been what we consider to be 24 hours? He jokes when Bryan says that things were created at this exact time. He goes, well, is that Eastern time, Central Standard Time? We have created the concept of a day. We have created the concept of an hour. We have created the idea that there are 365 days in a year. So if you read the Bible and it says a day, are you saying that these ideas that were created much later are to be back translated to the Bible. And this puts Williams Jennings Bryan in a corner. At this point, people know he's a blowhard. And the show trial, people of Dayton start to get embarrassed, and the trial sort of just comes to an end. He's found guilty. Scopes is found guilty, fined $100. Clarence Darrow pays it. The long-lasting legacy of this, though, is this idea of religious liberalism versus religious fundamentalism. Adaptability. Evolution is a part of it, but it's not nearly as much of a part of it as people would like to think. All right. Well, that is a very brief lecture on the Roaring Twenties. Monday, big time lecture, Great Depression and the alphabet soups of the New Deal. You guys have a great day and have a good remainder of the week. Enjoy the beautiful weather. Peace, be safe, and make good decisions.